All right, let's dive into the world of botanical drug manufacturing. We're talking about cannabis, psychedelics, and these crucial CMAs, critical material attributes, those things that make sure the quality and consistency are, well, consistent. When you take any medication, you don't want it to be a total guessing game every time.
Right, exactly. And that's where things get especially interesting when we're talking about botanicals. Unlike synthetic APIs, where you're starting with a pure chemical compound, here we're dealing with raw materials like cannabis or psychedelic mushrooms, and nature, as you can imagine, is not exactly known for its uniformity.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess the question is, what makes these botanical starting materials so different?
Well, think about it. You've got a field of cannabis plants out there exposed to all sorts of variables, right? Sun, rain, soil composition, and even the specific strain, what we call the cultivar, has a big impact on the chemical makeup of the plant. So all that inherent variability in the raw material, well, it creates a unique challenge for manufacturers.
So I can try an analogy here. It's kind of like using fresh ingredients versus like a pre-made mix when you're baking. You're going to get more consistent results with that pre-made mix every time.
That's a great analogy. And because of that, being able to really control those specific CMAs, it's really important for botanical drugs. Things like moisture content, the particle size, even the microbial load of the raw material can totally make or break the final product.
Okay, I'm really interested to learn more about each of these CMAs. Let's dive a little deeper into those. What makes moisture content so important?
Well, moisture content is kind of like the Goldilocks principle for botanical drugs. Too much moisture, and you're basically creating the perfect environment for mold and bacteria to grow, which obviously puts patient safety at risk. But then if there's too little moisture, that can impact the drug's potency and how well it dissolves, and ultimately that would affect its effectiveness.
So it's got to be just right.
Exactly. And it's not just about those obvious contaminants either. Even things you might not think about, non-mutagenic impurities, can have a big impact, like acetamide and hydroxylamine, for instance. These are compounds that are often found in botanical extracts. And even in small amounts, they can change how a drug works in the body.
That's pretty incredible. It really highlights how important it is to, really carefully monitor all these CMAs throughout the entire manufacturing process. So what about particle size? What makes that so important?
Particle size is all about how well the drug gets absorbed by the body. Imagine trying to, dissolve granulated sugar versus powdered sugar. The powdered sugar dissolves much faster, right? It's the same with botanical drugs. Finer particles generally lead to better and more consistent absorption, which is key to getting that desired therapeutic effect.
Interesting. So we talked about moisture content, particle size. What else is on the, I guess you could call it the CMA checklist for botanical drugs?
We can't forget about the cultivar, which is basically the specific strain of the plant. It's like, think about different varieties of apples. A Granny Smith has a totally different flavor and texture than a Honeycrisp, right? Same idea with cannabis or psychedelic mushrooms. Each cultivar is going to have its own unique chemical profile, and that's going to directly affect the potency and characteristics of the final drug product.
That makes a lot of sense. So how do you go about actually measuring and controlling these CMAs in a real manufacturing setting?
That's where things get really technical. For something like particle size, we use techniques like laser diffraction. You pass a laser beam through the material, and the way it scatters tells us about the size of those particles. And then for microbial load, there's a method called plate counting, where we actually grow any bacteria or fungi that are present on a special media, and that shows us how much contamination is there. So all these tests are absolutely essential to ensure the quality and the safety of the final product.
I'm kind of amazed by how much actually goes into making sure these botanical drugs are consistent. I'm guessing that's especially important for meeting regulatory standards too, right?
Absolutely. Organizations like the FDA have very specific guidelines for the quality and safety of all drugs, and that includes the lists that come from botanical sources. So consistent CMAs are the foundation for being able to meet those standards and, minimizing the risk of having batches fail.
So it's not just about science then, it's about patient safety.
Yeah.
And making sure that these medicines do what they're supposed to do.
Exactly. And you have to remember, we're still early on in really understanding the full potential of cannabis and psychedelics. As the research continues and regulations evolve, the role of CMAs is just going to become even more important.
Speaking of research, I'm curious, how do all these variations in the raw materials, how do they actually affect that final drug product? It seems like that could have some pretty big implications.
You're absolutely right. The variability that's in that raw material ultimately affects two really crucial factors: potency and the impurity profile. Potency, that's the amount of the active ingredient that's actually in the final product. And then the impurity profile, well, that's everything else that's there besides that active ingredient.
Okay, so what happens if these CMAs aren't, if they're not carefully controlled? Does the medicine just kind of like become less effective or something?
Can be a lot more complicated than that, unfortunately. You see, inconsistent CMAs can lead to massive variations from batch to batch. So you might end up with one batch of a drug that's super potent and then another batch that's much weaker.
Oh, wow. That's not good. Imagine like getting different effects from the same medication every time you take it.
Exactly. And that's just the beginning. Variations in the impurity profile, well, that can also affect how safe the drug is and how effective it is.
Okay, that's a little concerning. So how do we make sure that these botanical drugs are safe and consistent for patients?
That's where those really strict quality control measures come in, and those regulations we were talking about. By very carefully monitoring and controlling those CMAs through the entire manufacturing process, from those raw materials all the way to the final product. That's how we can minimize those variations and make sure every batch meets the highest standards for quality and safety.
So basically, consistent CMAs, those are the unsung heroes of botanical drug manufacturing. They're essential to making sure these potentially groundbreaking treatments actually deliver on their promise.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, I think that's a great overview of the challenges and importance of these CMAs in botanical drug manufacturing. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, the bigger picture.
What do you mean?
Well, we can't just ignore the history, right? All that baggage and stigma that comes with cannabis and psychedelics, it seems like that might create some unique challenges, for regulators and researchers.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer of complexity, for sure. The historical perception of these substances, it's definitely had an impact on how they're regulated. But I think what's really exciting is the potential these therapies have to really drive innovation, not just in, how we treat illnesses, but also in how we approach that whole regulatory landscape for medicines.
That's an interesting perspective. It does feel like we're kind of at a turning point. The way we think about these substances is changing. So what does that mean for the future of botanical drug regulation?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic. We're at a point where the scientific understanding of cannabis and psychedelics is growing so fast, and we're getting these more rigorous clinical trials showing their therapeutic potential. So I think that's going to lead to a more evidence-based approach to how they're regulated.
To all our listeners out there, I really encourage you to stay curious and stay informed. This is a field that's always evolving. There's always something new to learn.
Absolutely, especially in an area like botanical drug manufacturing. Scientific advancements and regulatory changes are constantly shaping the future of these therapies.
What I find fascinating is this whole idea of personalized botanical medicine. Imagine therapies tailored to your specific needs, even your genetic makeup. It can be revolutionary.
It's a remarkable concept for sure. The ability to actually personalize medicine using botanicals, it really pushes the boundaries of what we know about drug development.
It almost sounds like science fiction.
Yeah.
So what would it take to actually, make that vision a reality?
Well, we'd have to overcome a few hurdles. I think first and foremost, we need a much deeper understanding of the chemical makeup of these botanical extracts. It's not as simple as, just identifying one active ingredient and saying, okay, we're done.
It's more complicated than that.
Oh, absolutely. It's a complex interplay of numerous compounds. And to make things even trickier, those interactions can vary from person to person.
So each botanical extract is like its own little universe of chemical interactions.
That's a great way to put it. And that complexity requires us to have, a much more sophisticated approach to analysis and quality control. We need to be able to precisely measure and control not just the levels of those individual compounds, but also their ratios and how they interact with each other.
That sounds like a pretty massive analytical undertaking.
It is. But the good news is that, we're seeing advancements in analytical techniques, things like high-performance liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry. These tools are giving us the ability to really unravel these complex botanical matrices.
That's good to hear. So, okay, let's say we're able to really get a handle on the chemistry. What's next on the path to personalized botanical medicine?
Clinical trials would be key. And not just any clinical trials. We need studies that are designed to really take into account those individual variations in how people respond to a treatment.
So we need to know not only if a botanical therapy works, but also who it works for and why.
Exactly. That means gathering data not just on clinical outcomes, but also things like, individual genetic and metabolic profiles, lifestyle factors, even the composition of a person's gut microbiome.
Wow, so personalized botanical medicine really requires like a much more holistic approach to research. It's not just treating a disease, it's treating a person.
I couldn't agree more. We need to move beyond that one-size-fits-all model of drug development and embrace this more nuanced understanding of how individuals actually interact with these really complex botanical systems.
It's a huge shift in how we think about medicine, and it feels like we're only just, starting to scratch the surface of what's possible.
Hmm.
Uh, what other areas of research do you think could really transform how we understand these botanical drugs?
Pharmacogenetics is a field with immense potential, I think. By understanding how individual genetic variations impact how our bodies process those botanical compounds, well, we can move closer to actually developing these truly personalized therapies.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It's like having a genetic roadmap that can guide us towards, the most effective botanical therapies for each person.
Exactly. And that level of personalization, it could drastically improve treatment outcomes and even minimize the risk of any adverse effects.
Okay, let's zoom out a little bit and think about the bigger picture here.
Hmm.
Do you see botanical therapies playing, a larger role in mainstream medicine someday?
I absolutely believe they have the potential to make a significant impact, especially as we're, dealing with this growing crisis of chronic diseases and the need for more sustainable and holistic approaches to healthcare.
It does feel like there's a growing awareness of, the limitations of conventional medicine. It seems like more and more people are looking for therapies that treat the whole person, not just their symptoms.
That's a great observation. And botanical therapies, with their long history of use in these traditional healing systems, well, they offer a wealth of knowledge that we can draw on to develop these new approaches to healthcare that are more in harmony with nature and the human body.
So we're talking about a real paradigm shift here, like how we view health and healing. But I imagine, actually integrating botanical therapies into mainstream medicine,
Yeah.
that would require some pretty big changes to our current healthcare system, right?
There's no doubt about that. It would require us to rethink how we educate healthcare providers, how we conduct research, even how insurance reimbursement works. It's a big undertaking, but I think it's a necessary one, especially if we really want to address those complex health challenges we face.
It's definitely a journey worth taking, I think. The potential benefits of these botanical therapies for individuals and for society as a whole, they're too great to ignore. This is a very exciting time to be following this field.
It really is.
For our listeners out there who want to dive deeper into all this, what resources or organizations would you recommend they check out, to learn more about these botanical therapies and the latest research?
There are some great organizations out there dedicated to advancing our scientific understanding and encouraging, the responsible use of these botanical therapies. The American Botanical Council, for instance, that's a fantastic resource. They provide tons of information on the safety, efficacy, and quality control of herbal medicines.
That's a great tip. What about research institutions? Are there any universities or research centers doing groundbreaking work in this area, botanical drug development, that our listeners should know about?
Absolutely. The University of Mississippi's National Center for Natural Products Research. That's a world-renowned institution doing some really impressive work on medicinal plants, including cannabis and psychedelics.
Those are some great starting points. I encourage all our listeners to, stay curious and stay informed as this field continues to unfold. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of botanical drug manufacturing, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important message is that consistent CMAs are the unsung heroes of botanical drug manufacturing. They're really the foundation for making sure these treatments are high quality, safe, and ultimately effective.
That's a powerful statement. Consistent CMAs are essentially the bedrock upon which this whole field is built. And as we move towards a future where personalized botanical therapies become a reality, well, the importance of those consistent CMAs is only going to grow.
Exactly right.
So that brings us to a final thought-provoking question for our listeners to consider. So what could the future hold for personalized botanical medicine? Imagine therapies that are tailored to your unique needs, even your genetic makeup. It's a pretty mind-blowing possibility.
Yeah. It really is. The concept of personalized medicine using botanicals, it really takes everything we know about drug development and flips it on its head.
It makes you wonder, what hurdles we'd need to clear to actually make that vision a reality.
Well, for starters, we need a much deeper understanding of the chemical makeup of these botanical extracts. It's not as simple as, just identifying one active ingredient and being like, okay, we're done.
So it's not that simple.
Not even close.
Yeah.
We're dealing with a really complex interplay between numerous compounds. And to make things even trickier, those interactions can actually vary from one person to the next.
So it's like each botanical extract is like its own little universe of chemical interactions.
That's a great way to put it. And that complexity means that we need a much more sophisticated approach to analysis and quality control. We need to be able to precisely measure and control not just the levels of those individual compounds, but also like their ratios and how they actually interact with each other.
That sounds like a pretty massive analytical undertaking.
It is. But luckily, we're seeing some really exciting advancements in analytical techniques, things like high-performance liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry. These tools are giving us the ability to, really unravel these complex botanical matrices.
That's good to hear. So let's say we, would get a better handle on the chemistry. What's next on the path to personalized botanical medicine?
Clinical trials would be crucial, and not just any clinical trials. We need studies that are specifically designed to really take into account those individual variations, how people respond to treatment differently.
So we need to figure out not only IFA botanical therapy works, but WHO works for and WHY.
Exactly. That means gathering data not just on the clinical outcomes, but also on things like individual genetic and metabolic profiles, lifestyle factors, even the composition of a person's gut microbiome.
Wow. So personalized botanical medicine really requires like a much more holistic approach to research. We're not just treating a disease, we're treating a whole person.
I couldn't agree more. We need to move beyond that one-size-fits-all model of drug development and really embrace a more nuanced understanding of how individuals actually interact with these incredibly complex botanical systems.
It's a pretty fundamental shift in how we think about medicine. And it feels like we're just, we're only beginning to explore the possibilities here. What a fascinating field.
It really is. And as we move towards this future of personalized botanical medicine, it's important to remember that those consistent CMAs we talked about earlier, they're really the foundation upon which everything else is built.
That's a great point to end on. Consistent CMAs are really the unsung heroes of this entire field. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on this deep dive into the world of botanical drug manufacturing. It's been a fascinating exploration.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the incredible world of botanical medicine. Until next time.